Good day, everybody, and welcome to Resolve to Live Forward. This is John Morrow. The message that we always like to pass on to you in this podcast is living forward is a choice. Living forward is a choice. It's a choice that I had to make. I want to welcome you back. Last week, we kicked off the series. It's a 6 month series. It'll go from April now through to 6 months out, if everything goes according to plan, by the grace of God, as I always like to say. But the series is really kind of like the journey of how one finds a way to live forward after a devastating traumatic experience. And I have said before, and I'll remind you again, my journey is specifically predicated upon the death of my wife and what I observed in this coming June 2nd of 2026 will be the seventh anniversary of her death. I did a TED Talk recently in Lake Alfred, Florida, which is available, by the way, if you want to watch it on TEDx Lake Alfred on the YouTube channel. In addition to that, my book, Resolve, Your Blueprint for Intentional Success, was woven around that journey. And the resolve power word and the seven behaviors encompassed, embodied in the seven letters in the word resolve, all tie together to a set of practices and behaviors that help an individual through a disciplined mindset and in spite of the anguish and the heartbreak, find a way to live forward. Have I overcome the deep, deep anguish and sorrow? No, not at all. I once told a friend not that long ago, in many, many ways, it's harder today than it was on the day that it actually happened. This series is going to touch on that journey. And today's specific series episode is entitled The Silence That Nobody Warned You About. The silence that nobody warned you. In my case, me, or any of you out there who relate. The silence that we weren't warned about that we would have to confront. Having shared the first episode with you, the first portion of this series over the course of the weeks that lie ahead by the grace of God, I want to begin today. And by the way, this particular podcast, if you are listening to it, it is made available on a number of podcast platforms, including Spotify and the Apple Podcast Store, but also other podcast platforms. And that's because I use a podcast hosting platform service called Buzzsprout. And I want to express my appreciation to the great folks at Buzzsprout because they make this process easy, schedulable, and provide me with excellent feedback and analytics that allow me to be able to see if I'm making an impact, and if so, who is actually downloading episodes and starting to connect with this particular message, because this is really all about finding the specific group of people who relate to this particular type of situation in their lives. I hope you'll share it with your friends if they too are going through issues of grief. And that grief isn't just what arises from the death of someone precious to you, something special. Death takes its form in grief across everything from divorce to bankruptcy to loss of a job that you love to the loss of a pet to a change in career to a fatal diagnosis, or at least a diagnosis that has evidently possibly a terminal diagnosis attached to it. This is what I try to talk about. I make mistakes. I stumble over my words sometimes, but I try to do as good a job as possible of reaching you. And I thank you for joining me today. Again, the silence that nobody warned you about. I'll just simply tell you that there was something that happened to me after loss, and nobody prepared me for this. Nobody gave me any guidance on it. And frankly, even in some of the grief counseling programs that I participated in, and I'm thankful for them, they were extremely supportive and helpful, but none of them really talked to me about it. None of them really addressed it or spoke directly to it. Or maybe it was there and I was just someplace else in my thought process because there's so much that you can't figure out, so much that you can't make sense of in this process. But it was certainly not about the tears, not even about the sadness, which still persists. It's the silence. Let me say that again. Silence. I don't mean the absence of noise. There's plenty of it. It's everywhere. Even in my house, without the TV on, sometimes I get noise because I have three fur companions who are kitty cats, and one of them, his name is Bella Boy. He's very demonstrative when it comes to making his presence known. He just, he's a loudmouth, but I love and adore him. But I'm not talking about noise. In this particular case, the silence I'm talking about is the silence that comes from the absence of that presence in your life. Let me say that again. It's the silence that comes from the absence of that presence that was constantly in your life. Let me remind you, I met my wife in the fall of 1972. We married in August 1973. And on the first Sunday of the month of June in 2019, after being in love for over 46 years and being married for almost 46 years, basically at that point, 2/3 of my life, she was gone. I would never hear that voice again, at least not in person. The presence was no longer there. Now, I'm going to say something, and some of you will rail at me for it, and I apologize. I don't mean to offend, but I have her ashes in an urn here in this office studio that I have in a bookcase over here that is a memory bookcase. Cherish memories of her. But her ashes are there. So there's a presence, but it's a presence that has no sound. It is impactful and cathartic because of its very silence. After everything had settled down in my life during this process, after the calls from people started to slow down, the cards stopped coming, after people went back to their lives and to their routine, and I'm guilty of doing this too, that's when I noticed it. A quiet house. Routines that I had always been going through, but they were empty now because I did them on my own. I had to. If I was going to take care of myself living in this house, if I was going to feed myself, if I was going to clothe myself, if I was going to do everything I was supposed to do to maintain some degree of quality of life and practice the best practices of being a homeowner and maybe even a retired homemaker, the routines were still nonetheless empty because it was up to me. That means that no longer were there moments that I had shared. They were gone. But I remembered them. But what I remembered more was the absence of the conversation. It's hard. It wasn't just the fact that she wasn't there. It was the fact that the life that we had built together and we rotated around each other with was silent. I can honestly tell you that what made it harder was realizing that everyone else's world kept moving. Now, I want to say something in fairness to them. That's not an unkindness on their part. You move forward. I've done it all my life. I've had friends who have suffered through the trauma of loss. not just death, but loss in many, many ways, in many forms, shapes, and fashions. And I have not always handled those well as it relates to how I treat those people. And I deeply, deeply, deeply regret that because the true compassion of empathy is walking a mile in someone's shoes, but at the same time, not drawing judgments and conclusions purely upon the basis of how I think it ought to be, because each of us is so very, very different. But the fact is, everybody's life continued to move forward. And here's what nobody tells you about the silence. Silence is not just external, it becomes an internal issue in your life. You stop expressing yourself, you stop reaching out as frequently to people, and sometimes you even stop thinking about what's next. Kind of like the question that I ask myself, what do I do now that my wife is gone? What do I do next? People don't disappear, they just don't know how to show up in situations like this. And I'm still guilty of that, although now there's a stronger urge built into my emotional psyche that tells me I need to reach out to people. I need to connect with them. Most people are not avoiding me. They're not avoiding you if you're going through this. They're afraid they'll say something wrong. And in a future episode, I'll talk about how people will say things that they mean to be good to you, but because they don't understand, you wish they'd never said it. And later on, after they realize what they said, they wish they never said it either. But that's the point. Uh, they're just afraid to say something wrong. They're avoiding that opportunity, but you still feel like it's a distance that's been put between you and them, and you don't quite understand it. So silence can become a hiding place for us rather than challenge ourselves, if I could say that. We are not careful. We start to get comfortable with the idea of silence. Not that long ago, I was talking to a friend and somebody said, you know, you still live by yourself. Don't you have a companion? No, the thought really of a companion um, hasn't crossed my mind to the point that I'm considering it. Yeah, um, it's popped in there from time to time and I wonder, but it's not something I'm interested in. I really, really don't think that solitude is what people claim to think it's cracked up to be. Sometimes solitude's good. Solitude's good when you're trying to read or to write, to journal. Solitude is good when you want to really hunker down and learn something. And then sometimes solitude is good when you want to quietly ponder your thoughts and hopefully meditate, or as in my particular case, sometimes for me, it's more about praying than just meditating. I come from that background. I'm a person of faith. So meditating is for me conversation with a force that is beyond my physical realm of living. But silence doesn't ask anything of us. It doesn't say a word. That's why it's called silence. Here's the problem with that. No one grows in isolation. I'm going to say that again. No one grows in isolation. If you are there, left to your own thoughts, your own ideas, your own thinking process, isolation can become dangerous. So, how do we begin to break the silence that we have allowed to, in a sense, wrap itself around us as we live on a forward basis? Uh, I'm going to give you some steps. I find these helpful, but at the same time, I had to write them down because if I don't write them down, sometimes they'll slip my mind. because I'm preoccupied with the difficulties of some days being harder than others. The first thing is say something, even if it sounds awkward. Now, that's interesting because that's a courageous step, saying something. It's like somebody coming up to you, for example, at church or in Toastmasters, as it is in my way of doing things, or if I'm out and about and happen to run into somebody I know in the community, they ask you, how you doing? Well, you could say, fine, I guess, or I'm okay. But maybe what you should do is you should put yourself forward and say something honest. The other day, somebody said, John, how are you doing? And I said, well, two things. One, from a physical point of view, I'm doing great. I really am experiencing right now a good quality of life physically, and I'm thankful for that. But I would be lying to you if I said I have great days every day because I don't. There are tough days for me. My emotions do get the best of me. I have to segregate myself from the world for which I still wish to engage. And it's okay. The problem is it becomes something that I do repeatedly that is potentially dangerous and even potentially fatal. So you break the silence, even if it feels awkward. So you do things like send a text or make a phone call, a simple message to somebody else where you tell them, I've been thinking about you recently. I did that with a friend of mine right now, whose wife is in a convalescent center and is in what appears to be a terminal condition. Yeah, we pray for her, but I also pray for him. But it isn't just praying for him because if I pray, usually that's a solitary thing. But if I text him or pick up a phone and call him, I'm doing something that sets me aside and puts him into the focus of my conversation. And here's an important thing to remember. You think, I don't know what to say. Well, guess what? Connection does not require perfection. Write that down. Connection does not require perfection. You think, I got to have the right thing to say. No. The fact that you care enough to say something, that matters. So take the first step, even if it feels awkward. Reach out to someone else. Also, reintroduce your voice. I do these podcast recordings because it allows me to hear myself. I do video recordings of my speech. I recently was watching my TED Talk, my TEDx talk from the Lake Alfred TEDx back in February. And I'll pull it up on YouTube and I'll watch it and listen to it. That's my voice, and that's my authentic voice. But there are other things that I can do. I'm not good at this, but I really want to get better at it. That journal, write your feelings down. Take a few moments, even if it's just a few sentences, a couple of paragraphs. And of course, I do believe in the power of prayer. But the whole idea is to record your thoughts. Be aware of how you feel. Be honest about how you feel. And express yourself with authenticity because your voice matters. And sometimes speaking out loud in conversation with yourself, somebody would say, only crazy people talk to themselves. That's BS. Talking to yourself is good. Praying out loud is good. Say it even if no one else hears it. Get it out. There are days sometimes when I stop and I pound something and then I scream. I don't do it on a regular basis, but periodically there are those moments where it's just, I've had enough. I'm over it. I can't deal with it anymore. Choose one place to re-engage. That was an easy one for me. Um, Obviously, church. Church is a place where I engage people. But even more so, it was Toastmasters, because Toastmasters is an organization that has had a tremendous impact upon my life. And during the celebration of life after my wife passed away, clearly a third of the audience in the church in that celebration Monday were Toastmasters who had come from places around the state of Florida out of respect for her and to honor me and to show me they cared. That's the reason why I continue to stay engaged with Toastmasters. People find so many excuses to do something else. But actually, when you are going through a broken period in your life, the best thing to do is to connect with people, because that group, that conversation, even that cup of coffee you have with a friend, you don't need necessarily to re-enter the world. You just need to take a step into what's going on outside of this place that is far too often silent. Because you see, the silence you feel is very real. But you know what? It doesn't have to be permanent. It doesn't have to be permanent at all. And it's certainly not how your story should end. I mentioned that sometimes instead of putting a period at the end of that sentence, you put a comma, which is your way of saying you're going to connect another part of a news story to that. Sometimes the way forward begins with a single word spoken into a very quiet place. A single word spoken into a very quiet place. Because I happen to be a person who has connected himself with this technology, and I have the capacity to record. One of the interesting things that I've discovered is that if I wanted to, I could set my microphone up. I could bring up a software that I have on my computer called Audacity. Audacity is a recording software. And I can turn on Audacity for recording, and I can sit there and talk into the microphone. And I can start pouring things out. And then I can save that recording and I can go back and I can listen to it. Now, somebody would say, is that therapeutic? It could be. Sometimes it's therapeutic for me. Of course, I don't just record it for the purposes of listening to myself. Sometimes I'll have it transcribed on a software so it becomes a transcript. And then I will load the transcript into creating what might be an article or a speech, a presentation, a podcast, or even a blog, although I'm not currently blogging. But the point is, it's putting myself out there. It's spoken in a very quiet place, but it's still my voice. And you have a voice, and sometimes you need to listen to your voice and listen to the voice that isn't harsh, but to the voice that says, you still have a purpose, you still have a meaningful life, you still have a direction, you still have something worth saying that is worth being heard. So here's the question that I want you to sit with right now. Where in your life has silence taken over? And what is one thing you could say to begin breaking the silence? I'm going to read that again because I wrote this down and I'm actually reading for it. Where in your life has silence taken over? Can you think of something that you could say to begin to break that silence? Begin with saying it to yourself. Write it down. Ask the question again. Answer it out loud. Think about it. I'm not asking you to go running headlong, full speed into that chasm. It's dark in there. I know you feel it. There are days, and this comes from a quote that I read from Dr. Martin Luther King. Stepping forward in faith is kind of like seeing a doorway and it's dark through the doorway, but you can see the first step. Take it. Take it with the sincere belief in faith that the next step will make its appearance. It's not about seeing the entire journey. It's about one step at a time as you choose to live forward. Living forward isn't always easy. Oh, no. It hasn't been easy for me. But as I said, this June 2nd, it'll be 7 years. The silence is still deafening. The pain is just as acute as it was then. But I still choose to live forward. And I don't have a clear picture of everything that I want to do. And some days I don't even have, with respect to plans, a definite, firm plan of action in front of me. Sometimes it's just get as much out of the day as possible and remember the 7 behaviors that I challenge myself with every day from the word resolve, Resolve. But what I will say is this: your particular journey right now, where there is trauma, where there is heartbreak, where there is sorrow, where there's anguish, where there is this grief, and it is pervasive and it clings to you with claws that are cold and harsh and painful, and it wants to pull you to a dark place, you must push back. And the first thing that you can do is to break the silence by speaking. Speak. Oh, there's something I'd love to talk about in the not too distant future, a documentary entitled just simply Speak. But that's for another day and another time. I'm looking here and I realize my time is drawing to a close for this episode. This is actually the second episode for the month of April. And by the grace of God, I look forward to seeing you at this time next week, where we'll have message number 3 in this series. I thank you for your downloads and for your participation and engagement. And I ask you to share it. If you haven't checked out, by the way, my YouTube video, go to YouTube and type in TEDx Lake Alfred, and you'll find my message there. It's called Living Forward is a Choice. My email address is johnmorrowcoaching@gmail.com. This podcast is resolved to live forward. It all ties together. And you can find my book on Amazon in paperback and in digital download. It's entitled Resolve, Your Blueprint for Intentional Success. I would be incredibly thankful for you to check these out, but also to respond to this particular episode and help me to reach the people that I know I can connect with through this story. I'm not the only one out there talking in this particular area of specialty, but I get you, and I think you get me as well. Thank you for joining me today. I'm John Morrow. I look forward to seeing you again, hopefully this time next week. Until then, remember, always, always, always resolve. Make the choice live forward.